Should the Falcons trade back in round one? And if so, will they find a difference maker in the secondary in Georgia's safety, Malaki Starks?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can get $150 in bonus bets for new FanDuel customers if your first $5 bet wins. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this podcast. And I think each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day as everydayers, that means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everyday, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is another Mock Draft Monday where we get to do a deeper dive on a prospect that is projected to the Atlanta Falcons in a recent round one mock draft. But we'll also be talking about potential trade back opportunities for the Falcons and why, despite the team's desperate need for, help in terms of their pass rush, we aren't talking about that in round one as much as probably a lot of people think we should. But this week, we're really looking at the mock draft from Dan Parr over at NFL.com, where he had the Falcons trading back from pick 15 to pick 20 with the Denver Broncos, picking up a 3rd and 4th round pick in this upcoming draft and selecting Georgia safety Malaki Starks with that 20th pick. And this is a good opportunity to talk about why, one of the reasons why we're talking about this is, the Locked On Falcons Insiders. I sort of reached out to them to see if they were interested in talking about an edge rusher on Mock Draft Monday versus a trade back scenario. And it was about even split on terms of where people's heads was at. But, I think a lot of people are interested in this trade back scenario. And it makes sense with Malaki Starks just because recently I did a film breakdown of him and several of the other top DBs in the draft class for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. Over 2 hours of film analysis on 7 of the top DBs, including Starks, Travis Hunter out of Colorado, Will Johnson, Michigan, Azarie Thomas for Florida State, Shade Barron, and Andrew Makuba for Texas, and Nick Emanwari from South Carolina. And hopefully we'll be looking at some of the top pass rushers later this week for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. Abdul Carter for Penn State, Starks' 2 teammates at Georgia, and Jalen Walker and Mikael Williams, James Pierce Jr. out of Tennessee, the 2 Michigan D tackles, and Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham. And it's all available for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can become one by joining that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. This is a 14-day free trial, so you can get that film analysis of these draft prospects for free for the next 2 weeks. And then if you like it, you can keep going for $4.99 a month. But, in addition to that film stuff, you will also potentially influence, help steer this ship that is the Locked On Falcons podcast. But without further ado, let's talk about Malaki Starks. 3-year starter at the University of Georgia, came in, immediately was productive as a true freshman back in 2022. His first collegiate game, he snagged a beautiful interception against Oregon. Played all over the defense, spent significant times playing in the slot these last couple of years. Going into this past season, was kind of projected by many people to be a potential top 10, top 15 pick. Didn't have quite the 2024 that I think a lot of people were expecting. A drop in ball production, only 1 interception, 2 PBUs this past year after 5 interceptions and 12 PBUs in the 2 previous seasons combined. I mentioned on the most recent episode of Locked On Falcons with Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta, talking a little bit about some of these Georgia prospects, including Starks. And I said, I don't necessarily think he has a first round trait. Right. I think he's kind of a B player at multiple, B plus, B minus here or there across the board. But if you're going to say that he does have an A-level trait, it is those ball skills. When you look at the highlight reel interceptions he had against Oregon in 2022, as well as this past year in the season opener against Clemson. But when you look at the other areas of playing the safety position, whether it's playing deep, whether it's run support, whether it's man coverage, I kind of think he's solid, but nothing spectacular in those areas. And, we talked quite a bit about the Falcons asking their safeties to often cover the slot this year, from depth this year. And we mentioned, earlier this month how that led to some issues, I think, in the second half of the season, where a couple of offenses were able to exploit that to a degree. And, potentially a player like Starks with his slot background, could he solve that problem? And again, I don't necessarily love Starks as a slot cover guy. I think he's better than your typical college player is going into the NFL, but I don't look at him as a guy that projects well to doing that full time in the NFL. You compare that to his former teammate in Javon Bullard, who was drafted in the second round this past year for the Packers and started out as their starting safety, but due to some reshuffling in their secondary, due to some injuries to like Jair Alexander, he finished the season as their full-time sort of main slot guy. And from what I understand, obviously not watching as much Packers football as, say, Peter Bukowski of Locked On Packers, but from what I understand, he played well enough that he's probably going to go into 2025 as their main slot guy. And Bullard and Tyke Smith were Starks' predecessor as the primary guys covering that slot at Georgia. And at least based off of their PFF metrics, Bullard and Smith were far more productive in 2022 and 2023 than Starks was in either of those years, as well as 2024 when it came to covering the slot. So I think Starks offers that versatility, but I'm not drafting him thinking, oh, I just killed two birds with one stone. I got a safety and a good slot player in that regard in terms of locking that down. So I do think the benefit of Starks's slot experience is, though, rather than necessarily being a guy that I would trust to lock down slot receivers in the NFL, I do feel like he could be a very effective tight end eraser in the NFL, right? That when you look ahead to this 2025 season with the Falcons and you have tight ends like George Kittle and Trey McBride and TJ Hawkinson and Dalton Kincaid, among others, on the schedule, I'm not saying that, Malachi Starks will shut those guys down, but I will sleep a lot easier with the Falcons' ability to match up with those types of tight ends with Malachi Starks on the defense than we have probably had since the prime of Keanu Neal back in 2017. So I think Starks' value is not necessarily this immediate impact. He's going to change, the defense for the better right away. It's really about where he's going to be with some development. And that's true for pretty much all draft prospects. And while he is, I'm considering him more of a B player on the field, from what I've heard, he's an A++ character guy off the field. And he has that sort of makeup that the Falcons typically covet. And so it's the idea like, okay, he's been an undergrad at Georgia these last couple of years, and now it's time for graduate school. And the 2 to 3 years of grad school that he'll get playing safety next to Jessie Bates in the NFL could be extremely valuable. And if you can get sort of some of Jessie Bates's abilities through the power of osmosis rubbing off on Malachi Starks, that could wind up being a very, very valuable player in a couple of years, right? That you couple Starks' athleticism, and I'm expecting him at the combine to run fast, right? In the 4.4s. I don't know if he'll get to Lewis Seen, the former Georgia safety's 4.38 at the combine, but I do expect Starks to run fast. But, you take Jessie Bates's neck up ability, combine it with Starks' neck down ability, that could make for a very potent NFL safety, to the point that when we get to like 2027, that sort of development that Starks could have, we'll look back at, any knuckleheads that were sitting here in 2025 saying this guy doesn't have a first round trait. When we're watching Starks be that all pro safety in 2027, those people will look pretty stupid at that point in time. So that's kind of where I feel with Malachi Starks and his potential ability to impact this Falcons defense. He would be an upgrade at the Falcons safety position, but I don't know if you're going to get that sort of instant high level impact at that position, in year one, but years 2, years 3 and beyond, then I think there's where the potential of Malachi Starks comes in. So, the other aspect of this mock draft that Dan Parr put out there is the trade back scenario. And I think that's a very realistic option for the Falcons. And we'll talk about all the reasons why it makes sense for the Falcons to look to move back a couple of spots, whether that's to land Malachi Starks or another player in this draft. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that action than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off, or you just want to wait to the fourth quarter comeback, that epic comeback led by Trae Young or Dyson Daniels or whoever is in the mix, you can stay in the action with FanDuel. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, hey, man, go ahead and combine those live bets into a same game parlay, looking at rebounds, points, assists, whatever you want. FanDuel has it all. And it's not just for the NBA, it's upcoming NFL season predictions, upcoming Major League Baseball predictions, hockey, tennis, soccer, highlight, all that you want is available at FanDuel. So right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So in Dan Parr's mock, he had edge rushers go pretty early off the board. Number 2 overall, Cleveland took Abdul Carter of Penn State. Number 7, the Jets took Jalen Walker of Georgia. Number 8, the Panthers took Mikael Williams of Georgia. And in this scenario that Dan Parr laid out in his mock draft last week, the Falcons would potentially have their pick of the next group of edge guys at pick 15. Mike Green of Marshall, Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M, Donovan Ezerako of Boston College, and James Pierce Jr. of Tennessee were the other 4 edges that Dan Parr had mocked in the first round. And if the Falcons came away from this, pre-draft process and evaluating all these players and feeling like, hey, all these guys are roughly in the same boat, none of these guys really stand out at the top of our board to the point that we would value one of these guys on a tier above the rest, then it totally makes sense for the Falcons. Hey, move back a couple of spots. You'll still get a very similar player and also pick up some valuable draft picks in the middle of the draft. And in this case, Parr had the Falcons moving back 5 spots with the Broncos, picking up a 3rd and 4th round pick. That's a very justified trade for the Broncos, not something that he's just pulling out of their butt, because in this example, the Broncos trade up for Penn State tight end Tyler Warren, and I saw a recent clip of Sean Payton on Up and Adams before the Super Bowl talking about Denver's need for a joker on their offense, which he defined as a running back or tight end that can be sort of an elite pass catcher and create mismatches in the passing game. And it just made me think, man, wouldn't it be incredible if the Falcons had 2, high-level athletes at the running back and tight end position that would provide a similar boost to their offense? But unfortunately the Falcons don't have any of those guys and whatnot. So or maybe you just need a play caller like Sean Payton to be able to unlock such talent. But I digress. Anyway, so I think this is a fair trade compensation for the Falcons. Like, if you're looking to get more than that on the trade back, than like 2 mid-round picks, like the 3rd and 4th round pick that Parr suggests, you probably have to move back more than 5 spots, potentially 10, 15 spots if you're looking for like a 2nd round pick or something like that. But I think picking up a 3rd and a 4th would be huge for the Falcons right now, because as we've discussed so many times since the end of the season, with the Falcons being limited to 5 picks in this current draft and only 3 of them in the premium rounds, the first 4 rounds, they have a 1st, a 2nd, and a 4th, the Falcons are going to find it exceedingly difficult to walk away from this draft being able to hit on those picks, because it basically means they have to go 3 for 3 on those premium picks, and that's not easy. So picking up a few more picks means that you lower kind of the threshold for your batting average. Going 3 for 5 is a lot more realistic than going 3 for 3, as well as the additional ability to fill 2 more needs on your roster, where the Falcons have a ton of needs. I think we talked about this on last week's Mock Draft Monday when we talked about Will Johnson, the Michigan cornerback, and I think I mentioned how you can argue the Falcons have 8 positions on their roster that could use upgrades in terms of the starter, right? And the chances of them finding, they need assets if they're going to find, 5 starters this offseason, let alone, 8 of those guys. So the more draft assets the Falcons can acquire, the better it is for their draft. And again, I think trading back makes a ton of sense given their overall needs. The question really is about, whether the board is going to fall a certain way that's going to make it worthwhile for the Falcons to trade back. And in this scenario, I do think the board kind of fell a certain way, right? And this is not my final say. This is very early in the process, so I don't want to necessarily, anybody to clip this and be like, you said this in February. And it's like, yeah, because it's February. I can say a lot of things in February. But, early on, this early in the process, to me, in terms of what I have looked at in terms of the edge rushers, it does feel like there's a big drop-off after Abdul Carter. And it feels like the other guys are kind of jumbled up into the same sort of pool. And it's kind of just a pick your flavor of edge rusher in that regard. And, and so to me at this point, if the board falls a certain way, like, I'm not going to necessarily, again, we'll see how it all plays out. But it's one of those things where, like, I feel like you can kind of potentially, if you're the Falcons, and feel like, okay, well, yeah, we can, as I said, you can move back like 5 spots, 6 spots, 7 spots, whatever, and still get a comparable player if the Falcons are going to go for an edge rusher. So I think a trade back totally makes sense for the Falcons. And given they have so many other needs, even if the edge rusher that you're eyeing goes off the board, this is a deep enough draft class that you still should be able to make up for it with, maybe double dipping on day two if you don't get that sort of instant impact defender. The IID, as Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta would say it, or I think the I stands for immediate, but instant, immediate, whatever you want to go with. And so, I do feel like the way that this draft is looking, the way that this offseason is looking, it does sort of push the Falcons in a direction where a trade back becomes a very sensible thing for them to do. We'll see how it all plays out, and when the way that the board falls, but talking about these edge rushers, that gets us to, this massive need that the Falcons have. And, you're probably sitting here wondering, like, why aren't we talking about the Falcons taking an edge in round one? And so that is where we'll, talk about why we're not having that conversation in earnest as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So let me be clear here, guys. I fully expect the Falcons to take an edge rusher in the first round of the 2025 NFL draft. Now, I know those are famous last words, and I recently looked it up going back to like the 2010 draft, so like the last 15 drafts. I would argue that 12 out of those 15 drafts, we went into the draft with a pretty high expectation that, taking a pass rusher, we won't say purely an edge rusher, but a pass rusher. And I should qualify. I should say I expect the Falcons to take a pass rusher in round one. Now, I think it's most likely it's going to be an edge rusher, but it's a possibility, especially in a world where they decide to cut Grady Jarrett this offseason. It's a possibility that they could lean towards a D tackle, right? At that 15th overall selection or earlier or later in the draft. But going back to the last 15 drafts, 12 of those 15 drafts, I think there was a high expectation that the Falcons' top selection would be used on some type of pass rusher. And out of the 12 times that we had those expectations, the Falcons did it twice, right? Vic Beasley in 2015 and Takk McKinley in 2017. So I know you guys are spiraling right now, right? It's why so many of you guys get frustrated when folks like myself have the audacity to talk about anything other than an edge rusher or a pass rusher in round one, right? It's the idea that you reap what you sow, and the Falcons have not reaped a good pass rush in basically 2 decades in the NFL because they essentially refuse to sow those seeds by taking those pass rushers early in the draft. But the reason why we're not really having that conversation is I don't think it's that compelling a conversation at this point in the calendar, right? There are really 2 conversations surrounding the Falcons, particularly taking an edge rusher in round one. It's who do you like? That's one conversation. And then the other conversation is how the board falls. And really, we're not going to have a clue how the board is going to fall until we get closer to the draft, right? We can't have that conversation in earnest until after free agency, after the combine, after free agency, after teams start filling needs, right? You can argue as we sit here today in the middle of February that arguably half the league probably has edge listed as one of their top 2 or 3 needs heading into free agency. And half of those teams, so about a quarter of the league, are picking ahead of the Falcons with those needs. And, if several of those teams wind up addressing their edge rusher positions in free agency, that's going to change how the board falls, right? And that's true of not just the edge rusher position, but any position in the football. That's why, free agency matters when it comes to the draft. And then you look at the veteran trade market, right? Myles Garrett, Trey Hendrickson, Micah Parsons, Max Crosby, all these rumors about these guys being on the move. I'm a little skeptical of those movers, whether or not those teams will wind up trading those guys in the next couple of weeks. But, just because those guys don't get traded doesn't mean that there won't be other trades. I've heard, buzz about, Kwity Paye of the Colts and Sam Hubbard and Boye Mafe or some of these other names that I've seen people float around as potential trade options for teams to acquire in the next couple of weeks between now and the draft. And so, that's where the board is going to, that's why we can't necessarily have that board, how we're going to stack the board conversation until we get to April and whatnot. Now, that first conversation on who do you like, that to me is a more compelling conversation. But to be honest with you, I don't think we can really have that conversation in earnest because, sorry to say this, I don't think most people really have a clue what they want and or like in terms of pass rushers. And I don't say that to suggest I'm, an expert in that regard, but as someone who has been pining for the Falcons to take a pass rusher in most of the last 20 or so drafts, I can think back to 2004 when I was like, man, I hope we get Will Smith out of Ohio State. We wound up getting D'Angelo Hall with that top pick. But, been pining for, predominantly edge rushers and offensive linemen for the bulk of the last 20 years, right? And so because of that, I've watched a lot of edge rushers and offensive linemen over the years, and those are positions that I feel, somewhat confident in my ability to project and evaluate those players. And so, to me, why the conversation isn't as compelling is because you can kind of look back at last year's debate with the Falcons taking one of the top 3 edges in last year's draft in Dallas Turner, Laiatu Latu, or Jared Verse. And Jared Verse, for the most part, at least among Falcon fans, was kind of the forgotten man. Now, I know there were several Falcon fans that were, planting their flag on the Jared Verse hill and saying that's the guy. But by the time we got to the draft, the bulk of that debate was focusing primarily on Dallas Turner versus Laiatu Latu. And then we watched Jared Verse dominate the league last year. And, there are lessons to learn from that whole exercise. And I don't know if everybody's learned those lessons. Now, I personally look back at my evaluation of Jared Verse and feel like there were certain things I got right. There were certain things I got wrong in that, right? What I got right is, not thinking that Jared Verse was particularly going to get a ton of sacks in the NFL. And so far, that's the case, right? That was the main reason why I felt like he was maybe less justified to be a top 10 pick, because you want to get a guy that's going to get a ton of sack production. And we talked about Jared Verse because of his power profile being more of a pressure guy, right? And he showed that this past year. He had 89 pressures this year, according to PFF, including the playoffs. But if you look at a typical sack conversion rate of 15%, for edge rushers in the league, which meaning about 15% of the pressures turn into sacks, that would mean, based off of Jared Verse's pressures, he should have had 13 or more sacks this past year. He finished this year with 4.5 sacks, right? And the reason for that was what I pointed out last year, was I think the lack of elite bend and burst, to turn that corner meant that he was going to get a lot of pressures, but not be able to turn a lot of those into sacks. But what I got wrong was just underestimating how effective a pressure guy Jared Verse would be. Right, that we knew that his power would immediately translate. That was something that we talked about a bunch last offseason, that his power would absolutely translate to the next level. But I certainly did not expect it to translate as well as it did. And I'm sure many of you did not expect that out of Jared Verse. And if you had asked me before the season, like, how many pressures would Jared Verse get? Yeah, 40, 50. That's pretty typical of a high-end first-round pick. So that's a good ceiling, expectation for Jared Verse. Because basically in a decade prior to Jared Verse, only a handful of rookies and first round picks, hit that 50 pressure mark or above, right? In the first round, that was Nick Bosa, Joey Bosa, Will Anderson, Bradley Chubb, Khalil Mack, and Aiden Hutchinson. And so it's like, yeah, that's, I'm not expecting Jared Verse to come in and blow those guys out the water. I did not have that on my bingo card. So Jared Verse certainly blew those expectations out of the water when it came to that. And so that's the thing that I got wrong about that. And so, when we have that conversation about who do you like, it's like, what type of skill set are you looking for? Are you looking for that guy that can have that high floor, that has that power rushing profile that Jared Verse had? Are you looking for the guy that has the speed and the bend to generate a bunch of sacks and whatnot, in addition to those pressures? What's the scheme the Falcons going to run? We don't really know if the Falcons going to be a 4-3 team or a 3-4 team. And we've talked before about how, for the team, it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference what front you are in, but for individuals, it does matter, right? Some guys are better rushing out of 2-point stance. Some guys are better rushing out of 3-point stance. Some guys are better dropping into coverage. I think that was a big reason why people kind of were not as sold as Jared Verse being a great fit, because the Falcons were going to be a 3-4 scheme, and Jared Verse was not necessarily a coverage guy, a guy you wanted to play in space, but he gets drafted by the Rams. They play a 3-4. You know what the Rams did? They just didn't drop him into coverage. It's like, gasp, what a novel concept of, molding your defense to the quality and skill of your players. What an incredible concept that the Rams came up with last year. If only the Falcons could follow suit in that regard. So that's why, if you're sitting here wondering, 2 mock draft Mondays in, and it's like you haven't talked about the Falcons taking an edge rusher, that's one of the reasons why, because it's not that compelling a conversation. The other part of it is I want to get more eyes on some of these pass rushers before we start having some of those conversations in earnest as we get closer to the draft, so that we can be more informed in those conversations in terms of talking about what these guys offer in terms of skill set. What's their upside? What is their floor? What is their ceiling? All those various things. So, that's part of the reason why we're kind of punting and delaying that edge rusher conversation here on Locked On Falcons, at least on the mock draft Mondays. I'm sure we will have plenty of those conversations in the 9 weeks between now and the draft, 9.5 weeks between now and the draft. And, I'll admit, guys, it feels a little naughty, right, to talk about other positions for the Falcons in round one, just because we already know, right? We know right? Terry can't draft he can't avoid a pass rusher in round one, right? Again, I'm sure plenty of you are like, well, he could go in another direction defensively instead of a pass rusher. And it's like, sure. But like, we're going to be Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad and like, hey, man, he can't keep getting away with this, Like that's kind of where we're at with Terry Fontenot. But it is a little naughty, right? It is a little nasty, right? In the words of Tinashe, where you at? Who's going to match my freak when it comes to talking about other things beyond the edge rusher position? For all like, you can't tell below the camera, but, I could be squeezing my nipples right now. You don't know what pants I'm wearing. And people are probably sitting here wondering, like, Aaron, what are you talking about? What is this podcast turned into? Like, you're sitting here talking about being a nasty little freak. You're talking about pumping Penix. It's like, man, what's going on in your life? And I'm like, hey, man, that's between me and my therapist. So you just got to take it out. You just got to get it on this podcast. So, it is an interesting conversation when you talk about some of these other positions. And so I'm like, okay, here is the theoretical, other alternative options, to get a little bit serious for the Falcons in round one, as opposed to the thing that we all kind of know has to happen. It has to happen. They got to take a pass rusher in round one. They got to. And so whether that involves trading up for one, staying at 15, trading back for one, we'll have to sort of see, and we'll have a better idea of, what that's going to look like as we get closer to the draft in April after free agency, to see what types of moves the Falcons make on the defensive side of the ball, right? We're sitting here talking about, alternative options on defense, a corner, a safety, a linebacker in round one. All those options are on the table as we sit here in February. But maybe after March, after the Falcons actually go out there and try to improve their roster. Good God, like we just keep coming up with all these incredible ideas here on this podcast. Like, oh my God, like what? Trying to improve your roster? Wow. I'm getting a little hot and bothered, guys, just thinking about it. But, we might get to March and free agency and they might go out there and sign a linebacker. They might go out there and sign a corner, might go out there and sign a safety and be like, okay, like they're clearly zeroing in on, that edge or that D tackle in round one. So that's part of the reason why we haven't had that conversation so far here on Locked On Falcons. So, before I pass out, from getting a little woozy thinking about the Atlanta Falcons, because the blood is leaving my brain and going to other places because I'm thinking about other things besides the Falcons taking an edge rusher in round one. We will end this podcast, but this is a great opportunity for you guys to be nasty little freaks. And, if you're upset about, that we're not talking about the edge rusher, you don't have to be, right? We're going to have those conversations, and you can, if you don't want to wait to have those conversations, you want to have them sooner versus later, that's a good opportunity for you to become a Locked On Falcons Insider at the link in the description below. 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. After that point, you can kind of steer the conversations over the coming weeks. We'll be doing Q&As and mailbags. We'll be looking at not only these top draft prospects at a variety of positions beyond just the edge rusher position, but certainly immediately on the docket, we'll be talking about some of the premier edge rushers in this draft class. But we'll also be breaking down whoever the Falcons wind up signing a free agency. And I'm almost going to swoon, guys. Like, I'm sorry, I got to get through the spiel before I pass out. Just thinking about the Falcons signing players and free agents. Like, what an incredible concept for this football team. So, become a Locked On Falcons Insider. You'll get access to all that stuff at the link in the description below. If you want to join the conversation in the Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below there. So all that's available for you to provide your feedback and show me just how nasty a little freak you are by talking about something other than the Falcons taking a pass rusher in round one. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast. And if you want to get, the insights elsewhere in the NFL, 2 shows daily here on the Locked On Podcast Network over at Locked On NFL. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every